Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Everyone, I hope you're doing well, inshallah. I want to go through a very important book that I'm reading, and I'm going to be reviewing, and I'm going to be speaking to the author himself in a few weeks about the book. So I thought that rather than reading a book by myself, I'd read it with you in preparation for our meeting with the author himself in a few weeks. So we're going to go through the introductory chapter. It's a very important book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, by Dr. Professor Sher Ali Tari. And it's an important book for a very number of important reasons, which I'm not going to tell you about now. What we're going to do is we're going to go through the book. We're going to read the introduction, add a forward together, or go through it together and discuss it, inshallah. So now it all starts in South Asia. It's all about South Asia, and we know, many of us who have a heritage in South Asia, in 19th century South Asia, this has been for historians an important place of study, South Asia, throughout its history, right? But for Muslim groups in the 19th century in particular has been an important focal point, because what happened then and there impacts and affects us even today as well. So it's not a division as such between ulama and Sufis, but the groups, the parties that were that emerged in this period, they both were learning from the same ulama. They both had a deep respect for tradition as well, and it wasn't even a division between reformers and traditionalists, right? Modern reformers and traditionalists. Okay, it was basically between how to understand the authority of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So in this book, what the author does, he engages with Urdu, the language of Urdu sources, Farsi sources, Arabic sources, and he looks at a number of debates between particular scholars. And one of them is Fazlih al-Khairabadi, between him and Shah Ismail, which took place in Delhi as such in the first decades of the 19th century. And Fazli Haq was known to be an expert, if you like, in what's called the sciences of mantiq, the rational sciences, right, in particular. And he gave a certain emphasis to reason, okay? But he was still a Sufi, right? So this binary of like ulama and Sufis doesn't exist. It's a very modern, Western, orientalist trope to put ulamas on one side and to say, well, ulama are different to Sufis. But we'll get to that at some point in the future, inshallah. And then between him and then you have Shah Ismail, right? He was the alim, the scholar of Madrasa Rahimiyya, which was founded by Shah Waliullah Dehlawi as well. So, and he emphasized the manqulat, the revealed sciences. So the manqulat, from the word naqal, is the rational sciences, which was a rich tradition. And you have Shah Ismail Shahid, who emphasized as such, who was part of the manqulat, which is the revealed sciences. So revealed sciences, you're talking about the Quran and Sunnah and so forth as well. And then you also have a second debate. So you have two scholars, Fazli Khairabadi and Shah Ismail. But you also have another debate which took place in the last decades of the century, the same century, between Ashraf Ali Thanwi, Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi, who's from the Deobandi tradition as such. And he spent most of his life at the Sufi shrine of Tanabawan. And then you had Ahmad Raza Khan, right, who is sort of the leading figure of the Barelwi tradition, and who was very, very vigorous in his defense of certain Sufi traditions as well. And he wrote many books, including a huge volume on Fatawa as well. So he's going to contend and use these four figures to explore the status of the Prophet Muhammad in modernity, because obviously this was a time when Muslims were going through a lot of difficulties in South Asia and India, and modernity. There was the ideas of modernity were present. Muslim power was pretty much gone. The Mughal Empire, as you followed from other lectures, was completely gone. And so this was a unique situation wherein people and ulama were thinking about um, how 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 to connect with God, how to connect with the Prophet, peace be upon him, in such a time of crisis, such a time of challenge as well. And so, debates were taking place. For example, that was it possible? Just to give an example, we'll cover this in the book. Was it possible for God to create a second prophet, Muhammad? Right? Could there be a second prophet, theoretically even, of Muhammad, peace be upon him as well? And so, what does this mean for our political theology? Because this is all about belief, but in a state of waning Muslim power as well. And what does it mean to have divine sovereignty? Okay, and um, and the legitimacy of the colonial state. Right, it was a British Empire who was in charge for all intents and purposes as well. So the author emphasizes theology, aqidah, in these debates. It was all about belief. So that's why these debates became very, very intense between these parties, between either Fazli Haq, Khairabadi, and Shah Ismail Shahid, or between Ashraf Tanwi and between um, Ahmad Raza Khan as well. So this is something to bear in mind. But there was a lot of ambiguity as well. It wasn't like they were just polar opposites. It wasn't like each of these four scholars were polar opposites of one another. Just to give you an example, Fazli Haq Khairabadi spent a lot of his time in British service, right? Whereas Shah Ismail Shahid kept distance from the colonial powers as well. And in fact, he even went for jihad in the northwest frontier, right? Side Ismail Shahid. But then you start getting ambiguities. Like at this point, you're thinking, well, okay, it makes sense. One is closely aligned with power, and one is distant from the state. One is distant from the British as well. But then we know that, for example, Fazl Khairabadi left Delhi and he began to work elsewhere. He left the courts, he left the government reports that he had, and he came back later on. But he supported rebels against the state. So he was working for the state. He left the state, but later on he supported rebels um, against the state. So how do we reconcile this as well? And even Shah Ismail Shahid, for all his talk about jihad, he never actually fought the British. He never actually fought against the British, but against the Sikhs. Right. So there's a lot of ambiguity as well. So this is something to bear in mind. Just to give you another example, in the foreword, there's mention of another ambiguity that people often forget about, and this is that a lot of ulama, a lot of scholars would go for certain places to study, um, and this would create a network of affiliation between the scholars and the students amongst themselves in places like Lucknow and or the Firangi Mahal, or in Delhi, or Madrasa Rahimiya. However, if you follow these students in their day-to-day activities, we see that even those students who, for example, might have learned the manqulat, the rational sciences, at the Madrasa Rahimiya, they might go to Fazl Haq to read Arabic texts, right? So they might go to the madrasa of Shah Ismail Shahid, but then to learn the rational sciences, they might go, or to learn Arabic, they might go to Fazl Haq to read Arabic. And in the evening, they might go and listen to Sama, right? Sama at the Naqshbandi shrine of Mir Dard, for example. Um, and they might take the uncle of Shah Ismail Shahid, Abdul Qadir, as their Sufi peer, as their Sufi master. So you can see there's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of complexity. And to say that, it was simply a binary between ulama and Sufis and certain traditions, actually the book is arguing from the outset that we can't use this. These aren't useful ways to understand these particular traditions. And what does it mean when we talk about a divide between Deobandis and Barelwis, right? And how stable was this divide? Was this really a divide? And was it as pronounced as it was? What did it mean for the average Muslim living in South Asia at the time, right? We like to think it's a big thing because in our time in the West, it's sometimes in certain communities, in certain circles, it's been made into a big issue. But the question is, was it really a big issue to the average person, or was this a debate between scholars, which sometimes poured out into the masses as well? So this is some things to bear in mind as well. So we kind of just run into the book. We dive right into the introduction here, and what the author does is that he dives into some examples, some recent examples, where there's been some tense altercations between Deobandis and Barelwi. So, for example, in 2006, he gives the example of a less known, rather obscure account, if you like, of how people were made to read their Shahada again, their kalima again, their testimony of faith again, um, before they could and to get married again, basically, because the imam that had led the funeral prayers was from the other sect, right? Or if you like, or from the other group, from the Deobandi group. So the imam that led the funeral prayer was an imam that was from the Deobandi group, and they shouldn't have prayed behind him. So the sheikh that was following the Barelwi denomination basically said, you all need to pray the kalima again, you all need to get married again, right? In other words, because you prayed behind him, you lost your Islam, right? So you can see how, like, these people are made to re-enter the faith, right? And made to get married again, because their faith is null and void because they prayed behind someone who was from a different doctrinal orientation, if I can use that word as well. And then he gives a second example, which is a lot more famous. This happened in 2011, when in 2011 the anti-terrorism court of Pakistan sentenced someone called Muhammad Shafi, who was a local imam from a place called Muzaffargarh, and his son Muhammad Aslam. They basically give him a sentence to go to prison, and it was on the charge of blasphemy, the blasphemy law, which in Pakistan is very, very controversial as well. So they'd been arrested originally in April 2010, because they'd been accused of removing a poster from their own family-owned grocery store, which advertised an event to commemorate the birthday of the Prophet, right? The Mawlid. So they'd removed it, and the accusation was that they'd removed it and they'd stepped on it, right? They'd trampled over it as well. And so because of that, trampling all over it, they were accused of blasphemy, right? Now, just a side note on the blasphemy law in Pakistan: it's meant to defend and protect all recognized religions. Okay. However, it's mostly applied against those found guilty of insulting the Prophet specifically. Okay, and the penalty can range from just fines to even a death sentence. Okay. Now, the court verdict against the Imam and his son was delivered 6 days later. Um, um, and so this was like another turning point, another clash between they used the blasphemy law, but the blasphemy law was basically there to animate and revive this sectarianism, which was rife and is still rife in Pakistan between Deobandis and Barelwis as well. Another one was the very famous assassination of Salman Taseer, right? He was the governor of the province of Punjab. This is the third example he gives. And he was shot dead by his own bodyguard, by a person called Mumtaz Qadri, because he believed that the governor had committed a sin by opposing the blasphemy law. Okay, and it was a high profile assassination. You can Google this stuff and read up on it. And many politicians, lawyers, human rights activists in Pakistan, said that, look, this blasphemy law is unjust and it's been used for ideological ends as well, to settle personal vendettas. Okay. So these are examples, and he gives some more examples as well. So this is all to do with this is animated by opposing imaginaries of prophetic authority, right? In South Asian Islam. So it was all around the authority of the Prophet, peace be upon him. How should a community, this is the question, the key question is, how should a community honor the Prophet's memory and normative example? Okay. So this book is really important because the author claims anyway, that it's the first comprehensive study of the Barelwi Deobandi controversy. Okay, and it's a polemical battle which shapes South Asia still today, and is still present in our communities even today as well. So, a lot of times when people study this controversy or write about this controversy, they use a particular lens to understand it, and they use a binary. They say either it's that or this or that, and often it's usually it's legal or mystical. So it's between a legal interpretation of religion and a mystical approach to religion, or it's between a Puritan and a populist version of Islam, or is between an exclusivist and an inclusivist approach to religion, or finally is between a reformist and traditional approach to religion. So these are very much categories that people use to try and understand these debates between the Barelwis and the Deobandis as well. However, the problem with this way of framing the discussion is it's a very liberal secular attempt to understand life and religion of a community who never understood things this way, right? So you're using a foreign, you're using an alien way which doesn't even apply to these people who don't even see it this way, to try and understand them as well. So he says we need another way of understanding this as well. And we need to find another way of understanding the debates that were taking place in terms of defining the boundaries of religion and what the competing rationalities were of tradition reform. So we need another way to look at this as well. And he basically is, the way we do this is we look at this through the lens of competing political theologies, competing political theologies. This is the way we try and understand this particular debate between the Barelwis and the Deobandis themselves. So, how should one imagine divine sovereignty, and its relationship to the Prophet Muhammad's authority during a colonial moment when Indian Muslims had lost their political sovereignty? Right. This is the critical question. We're no longer in power, and we're looking back at our tradition. We're looking at the time of the Prophet, the message of the Prophet, the embodiment of the Prophet in such a time of difficulty. How should we follow? How should we understand his relationship to God? How should the masses look at this? Okay. So how should people understand this encounter between God, the Prophet, during time of immense moral and political anxiety, right? And so, with the onset of British colonialism, centuries of Muslim rule over large parts of the Indian subcontinent came to an end. Okay, and so there was an urgency to demarcate, to rationalize, to set the boundaries of religion from internal threats from within the religion, but also from external threats, because we no longer have power, we no longer have political power that we might have had for centuries as well. And so he argues that we need to go through a sustained and careful consideration of the colonial context. We need to look at this time period very, very carefully, and we need to look at this with some sympathy as well. So we look at this book takes on two contrasting movements and visions of Islam in South Asia, Deobandis and the Barelwis as well. And so they were both very much part of South Asian intellectual tradition. Even though they disagreed, they actually had a lot in common, right? It's hard to accept that today. It's hard to fathom that the Barelwis and the Deobandis had a lot in common. And one of the things this book does do is try and show that as well. So despite it does show differences, but it also shows they actually had they had a lot more in common. For example, they were connected through common scholarly genealogies, right? They had the same textual reference point. They were looking at the same books in terms of getting authority, in terms of quoting past authorities, in terms of how they understood, in terms of their practice of reading texts. They had a shared geography. I mean, they were based in Delhi and northern India. This is where the debate took place as well. And so, this was where they were in the same place, and they shared a lot of commonalities, despite the fact that today we see the Barelwi Deobandi divide as a big chasm. when in reality, when someone really looks at it, it's not really a big controversy, but we asked the question as to why it became controversial and what's at stake here as well. um, and so we look at the ulama. The ulama are really the people who are the key actors in this debate, right? We're looking at key scholars, the key ulama who are involved in this debate between the Barelwis and the Deobandis. Um, and it's difficult to understand this for one important reason. A lot of times when we look at ulama, we look at them through the madrasa tradition. And unfortunately, in much studies, in my own research, the madrasas, there's a sort of madrasaphobia, right? That people show madrasa often, whether it's think tanks, whether it's academics, whether it's other religious nationalists, right? They show madrasas as a sort of place of extremism and radicalization, and they forget that the ulama and the madrasa have a long history, um, where they were entrenched in scholarly pursuits, in intellectual academics pursuits. And this has become more pronounced post 9/11 with the Taliban and with terror and so forth. And now you have a huge industry of people who are pumping out literature, very poorly written, poorly researched, very unsympathetic, very binary in terms of how they look at the ulama and how they look at madrasas as well. So this is a pathological narrative, right? It pathologizes madrasas, that people who go to madrasas are somehow, radical, and they become radicalized in these places. And this is what happens with Muslims generally, right? Muslims are looked at through a pathology. This is something that's wrong with them as well. But we need a more complex picture. We need a more rich picture, a more deeper picture of the South Asian scholarly tradition. And this is what this book sets out to do as well. So we go through depth, we go through details, we go through the ambiguities, we go through internal disputes, and we see actually this was quite complex, and this was quite rich, and it's quite revealing. And we need to be careful that we don't do a disservice to a huge tradition, right? A huge place in Islamic history, in global history even. Okay. And so we have the question around two debates. The two debates, if you want to take the Deobandis and Barelwi title away and just describe them, so if you were to just take the debate away, the titles away, and just try and describe what each group was focused on, you'll notice that it was quite nuanced, and you'll notice that actually it wasn't really a big difference. It was difference of approach. How do you approach your connection to God through the Prophet, peace be upon him? So one group was, and you can tell by my description of it now which one I'm talking about. So one group of scholars, ulama, their conception of tradition, the Turath, was pivoted around securing the absolute exceptionality of divine sovereignty. Like, God is divine, we need to keep him sovereign, right? We don't ascribe anything human-like to God, right? Or nor do we ascribe anything God-like to any humans, right? So absolute exceptionality of divine sovereignty. And so they articulated an imaginary of the Prophet, peace be upon him, which therefore had to emphasize his humanity, right? And that his subservience to the divine, his subservience to God. Okay. And so as a consequence, what you notice, this is the Deobandi tradition we're talking about in particular, is that when you read their writings, they assail, they focus a lot on ibadat and ritual practices, and they have a particular strong emphasis on weeding out anything that they feel that undermines, any practice that undermines divine sovereignty. So anything that is bringing you close to ascribing partner with God potentially. Okay. And obviously one of the key thinkers early on, the author argues, I would say there's other people, but the author argues in this book is Shah Ismail Shahid, who died in 1831. And so he argues that the Deobandi scholars took him as one of their pioneering figures. There's a debate to be had on this. I don't think it's entirely true, but we'll leave that for now, and maybe I'll talk about that later on as well. Another group, this is the Barelwi group, right? And look how similar they are in terms of what their emphasis is on, but it's just an approach. And their emphasis was they challenged this movement of reform, and they basically said that divine sovereignty is inseparable from the authority of the Prophet, okay, because he's the most charismatic and most beloved of God's creation. Okay, so in their view, divine and prophetic exceptionality were not opposed, but rather mutually constitutive and reinforcing. So they saw it as like coming together. Whereas the Deobandis were like, we need to keep these two things separate. We're not denying that God's sovereignty is there and Prophet's sovereignty is below him, or the prophetic sovereignty is below him. But they said we need to keep these things separate. We don't want to muddy the waters. Whereas the Barelwi's community was saying basically, well, yes, we accept that, but they're not separate actually. And there is this idea that they weren't opposed, but they reinforce one another. Okay. And so obviously for them it was people like Ahmad Raza Khan, right? And he was the one who vigorously defended the rituals and everyday practices which served to commemorate the prophetic memory, right, and charisma. And so he became a chief architect in that movement as well. And they were intellectually, in terms of their intellectual inheritance, they owed much to Fazl Khairabadi, who died in 1861, who vigorously opposed in many ways Shah Ismail Shahid. So we're going to talk about these people later on as well. What were some of these debates anyway, right? And so there's a lot of intellectual questions, but some of the questions that they were debating over, and maybe we'll explore them throughout the book, is the nature of the Prophet's authority as a mediator between God and humans. Okay, and in what is his capacity as the intercede in as his role as someone who intercedes on the day of Qiyamah, on the day of judgment. Okay, and also questions around what knowledge did the Prophet possess, alayhi salatu salam. Okay, and did he have knowledge to the unknown? Did he know about the ghaib? What was the normative status of rituals, devotional practices, everyday habits that didn't have a precedent from the Prophet, peace be upon him, okay, and his companions? So things that we don't have a direct reference for from the Prophet and his companions. What is the status of these things? You get into controversies around bid'ah and all of these other things, okay? And under what conditions do these things become heretical? Do they become problematic? Okay, and how was it decided? How do you decide these things as well, right? And then you get into more obscure academic debates. Again, you can see these are really academic debates, right? Can God lie, or can he contravene a promise, which was called imkanikism? Okay, or can God produce another prophet, imkan nazir? Or can he produce another prophet that lives in some other alternative universe, if you like, as well? And so these debates were all to do with law, fiqh. It was all to do with aqidah, theology. It was to do with everyday practices. Right? So you can imagine, even though these were sometimes academic debates and to do with God's sovereignty and the Prophet's charisma, this fed down into everyday practices that these communities were engaged in as well. So these were political. They were political, but they were also theological, and hence he uses the word political theology, and that's the way he uses. He that's a lens that he uses to try and understand, trying to understand how people imagine the law and how they set their boundaries for ritual practice as well. So this book is called Defending Muhammad in Modernity because it looks at the intra-Muslim conflict and it details on the imagination, how they imagine the Prophet. So they were defending Muhammad, peace be upon him, how they imagine the Prophet, peace be upon him, in modernity, in a political context where Muslims were no longer in power, and it was actually the British who were in power. So this is a very important conversation to have. Whenever we have it in the modern day, in the West or in our communities, we need to bear all these things in mind, that these things, a lot of these debates emerge because something happened in that context, right? We're not living in that world anymore. A lot of these debates, the average person on the street doesn't have a clue about. I mean, they'll identify with a movement, but if you scratch the surface, they won't really understand the intricacies of some of these academic debates, and nor are they expected to, and nor would the ulama say that they need to, right? But yet, this has become very, very sort of pervasive in our communities as well. So this is something to bear in mind when we get into this book as well. And a lot of this is to do with what's called a discursive tradition. So a lot of ulama, a lot of scholars, what you'll notice is when they're debating the Barelwis, the Deobandis, whether it's Tanwi, whether it's Ahmad Raza Khan, whether it's Fazl Khairabadi, whether it's Shah Ismail Shahid, they're looking at kitabs, they're looking at texts, they're looking at books, right? It's a discursive tradition, okay? And so you have to look at the reasonings, you have to look at the arguments that they make, you have to look how they cite things, and you just find that they were very, very thorough in terms of what they were citing, the particular text they were looking at as well. And so they were always looking at tradition. They were always looking at the turath, the inheritance of the ulama that had passed them, to bolster their arguments as well. So this was they were arguing within a tradition, within a paradigm as well. And so there are many traditions within the tradition of Islam, if you like. And so you know, this is important, because the reason this is important is a lot of times people say, oh, you know, this is orthodox, this is unorthodox, right? But actually within tradition you can have many, many disagreements. Even today, you know, Muslim scholars regularly have debates throughout centuries. Even from the Prophet's time, there has always been debates. So this is part of the discursive tradition of Islam as well. So all of them are working within this discursive tradition to give their views on some of the debates that we're going to be talking about as well. The other thing that's really, really important, you must understand this, is that a lot of academics, a lot of non-academics, a lot of people, when they talk about Muslims generally, and when they start talking about the Barelwi Deobandi divide, what they often do is they paint a good Muslim and a bad Muslim, right? You're either a good Muslim or you're either a bad Muslim. And this comes from an orientalist understanding between a legal perspective on Islam and a mystical perspective on Islam, right? And a legal perspective is usually seen as sort of, you know, it's a dry, boring form of Islam, and a puritan and it's a very puritanical approach to Islam. And what you have on the other side is Sufism, which is, can you sit down? I'm doing a lecture. Thank you, Dolly. Sorry about that. So and you have this Sufism, which is a soft version of Islam, right? And they have it, and this is a very political thing to do. As we know, reading our history, there is no good bad Muslim. There is no ulama who are only legally trained and not Sufis, or only Sufis and not legally trained. Actually, when we look at Islamic history, they were Sufis and they were scholars. They were part of the Sharia, they were part of the religious tradition, the intellectual tradition, but they were also part of the tariqah, right? And that was harmonized. So there's this effort to make a soft version of Islam. And the author talks about this quite at length in his book as well, about this low Sufism binary that is common. And this is true. And the whole idea behind this is to try and create this good Muslim, which falls within sort of, you know, a reasonable way of approaching religion, making Islam something that's comfortable for them, palpable for them. However, and then you have a bad Muslim who follows the law, you know, and is used in this way to say, well, these are the type of Muslims that we need to have surveillance over. These are the ones that we need to discipline. Right? This is completely alien to Islam, and this is common in many, many research venues. A lot of people, when they write about Islam, they approach Islam unknowingly, and sometimes in this way, right? So we need to avoid these pitfalls of looking at good Muslim, bad Muslim, and, you know, good Muslims are the ones who are Sufis, and the bad Muslims are the ones who follow the law. And you see this, for example, in how people understand Maulana Rumi, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, right? They get rid of all the fact that he's a scholar and so forth. He practiced the deen, and they only want to focus on what they perceive of some of the esoteric practices that he might be following in his approach as well. So these things are worth bearing in mind as well. And often, you know, Sufism is seen as a peaceful variety of Islam at odds with the least Islamic legal tradition. Okay, and this is a very, very gross, misleading caricature of Islam, right? And it's definitely not what Islam should be painted as. But a lot of people are guilty of this. And this is like an Orientalist fantasy, as the author says in his book. And he quotes a number of academics, a number of writers in the introduction who are guilty of this. Right? He's not holding back. He's saying what he needs to say. That they are guilty of this as well. So I just want to make this very, very clear. And this, what this book does, it engages with the authors, with these movements on their terms. right? Rather than coming with saying, well, let's look for Sufis, let's look for ulama. What are these people actually saying as well? And so this is something to bear in mind as well. Finally, this book is part of my own interest because there's a lack of research, there's a lack of understanding of traditional ulama, right? There's a lot of misunderstanding as a consequence of traditional ulama, of scholarship, and it's a lot to do with the political climate that we're in right now, of looking at the ulama as backwards, of and branding them with terrorism and extremism. So a lot of research does need to be done. So this book is really welcome in this conversation as well. What I'm going to do, God willing, inshallah, is go straight into the book in the next video, dive straight into this book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity. I will continue next video tomorrow. I do need to finish this book very, very quickly, so we'll power through it because I'm going to be meeting the author in a few weeks, and I'm going to be interviewing him about his books. If you've got questions in particular that you want to ask the author, then make sure you send me some questions in the comment section. Until then, stay safe. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You can come in now.